Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. This session is called Crossing the Digital Divide, Applying Technology to the Global Refugee Crisis. And I'm here today with our speakers from the RAND Corporation, both senior researchers. We will have the opportunity to learn from their experiences today as part of the Emerging Technologies in Peacebuilding and Preventions Lessons Learned virtual workshop. My name is Diana Shakat, and I'm joining from Amman, Jordan, where my work has been concerned with civil society strengthening, the introduction of novel computing degrees, refugee integration, and research for internet freedoms. Together with me are Jim and Shelley. Jim is a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. He has a PhD in systems science and applied mathematics from the Washington University. And some of the areas his current work is concerned with include cyber and electronic welfare, nuclear command and control, as well as refugees and forced migration. Shelley is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation with an MPA in Public Policy and International Development from Princeton University, and her work focuses on forced displacement, disaster recovery, international development, and education. Shelley is a published author, and her work has informed governments and international cooperation efforts in the Middle East. Welcome, Jim and Shelley. It's an honor to be here with you today. Our dear listeners, as we speak, millions are facing famine in Yemen. People who found a new home outside Syria are now being forced to return. Thousands from Venezuela are living under the horrors of human trafficking, many with no documentation or support. Afghanistan continues to be ranked as the least safe country in the world, and internal displacement is a reality for far too many Sudanese people. The human rights situation in the North Caucasus is harder to report on by the year. Chechen asylum seekers are being rejected despite critical threats over their lives, and over 40% of refugees from Myanmar are under the age of 12. This is why it's particularly important to be here today with people like Jim and Shelley, who do the fantastic work they'll be sharing with you, as well as the lessons learned throughout their experience. Jim and Shelley, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diana, for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone who is there listening to us. Jim and I are going to talk about a study that we published in 2019 about how technology is used in refugee settings. The study aimed to look in an overarching way at technology use in these humanitarian situations, along with needs and gaps, as well as opportunities to improve the use of technologies in these circumstances. And our primary focus for the study was looking at digital technologies, or ICTs in particular, as opposed to all technology writ large. Our report, in case you're interested, is available for free on the RAND website. You can just download the PDF if you're interested. And then as a final note, I'd like to thank the Schmidt Futures Foundation, which was the sponsor for the study. Let's see how I can, there we go, okay. So to give an overview of our talk, we'll provide, first of all, an overview of circumstances, and then we'll talk about uses of technology by refugees, aid agencies, and a variety of other stakeholders. And then I'll pass it to Jim, and he'll talk about business models for technology in refugee settings, ethics, security, and privacy, and then we'll both talk about some recommendations. And before diving in, I wanted to give a bit of a personal note, which is how I became interested in the subject. I've done a lot of work on refugee issues globally. I've worked on 10 studies at this point, and for me, some of this study was instigated by being in Beirut and getting into a taxi, and the driver was a Syrian refugee, and we were talking, and his home in Syria was destroyed. He had very few resources, and yet he was able to pull out a mobile phone and show videos of this, where he kept, the proof of his former life. And it really struck me that in many ways, refugees are grasping onto their cell phone as kind of a lifeline for many different types of purposes. So for this study, we did a literature review looking at about 100 studies. We interviewed a range of stakeholders around the world, United Nations agencies, NGOs, government groups, refugee leadership groups, private sector tech companies, and others. And then we talked to refugees. We wanted to learn what refugees thought about their own use of tech and needs. And so we did 12 focus groups with refugees in 6 countries. We did it in Pittsburgh, where I live, in the United States, in Colombia, in Zambia, Jordan, and Greece. So the first thing we looked at was, who uses technology in refugee settings and how is it being used? And so there really are a number of entities. Clearly, of course, are the refugees themselves. They're the host countries as they're managing circumstances for refugees, donors and aid agencies, tech companies themselves, and then other types of entities like consortia and universities and research organizations. And what we found by and large is that technology is really resulting in a lot of changes to everybody's roles. It's creating new roles, it's simplifying long-standing roles, and then it's also operating the way that programs are managed. At the same time, there's a lot more that could be done to improve how tech is supporting humanitarian circumstances. So to dive in a little bit more on some of the specific roles, so refugees are using technology. They use all types, phones and computers and social media and specific tools, and they sometimes participate in developing technologies. The host countries, they need to manage public services, they need to manage security, and they're also responsible for legal frameworks which govern how refugees and tech can interact. For example, whether or not refugees are allowed to access certain resources such as finance and so forth. The tech companies, they're providing typical products like Facebook and WhatsApp and Microsoft Office, etc. But they also create services that are specific to refugee settings. And many of them are donating skills and expertise. The donors and the aid agencies, they use tech to manage refugee responses and programmings. They use it to manage funding. They're tracking funding and project implementation through various tools. And the consortia are bringing everybody together. They're doing research and innovation and a variety of other types of roles. So we really zoomed in on use of technology by the refugees and the aid agencies in particular. Oops, there we go. Yeah, and the bottom line from our study on this is that there's a huge amounts of tech that are being developed for refugee settings, new apps and new programs, et cetera. But at the end of the day, most often it's mainstream applications that both refugees and aid agencies are using. Those are the most prevalent. And those are what both the refugees and aid agencies are finding most useful, as opposed to apps and other tools designed specifically for refugee settings. There are some exceptions to this, in particular among aid agencies who have some particular needs. And so this has really led us to conclude that the specific investment in tech specifically for refugees may not be the most effective use of resources, and there could be some other ways of using resources to improve tech. So among refugees, connectivity and access to the mainstream apps are really the most important. Facebook and WhatsApp came up over and over again. Refugees really place a high value on connectivity. They keep in touch with family and friends. They maintain their documents, they access services, they access information. And UN research has found that refugees can dedicate up to 1/3 of their income on remaining connected. So there's clearly a very high priority for them in comparison with many of their needs. Their phone in many ways ends up being kind of a lifeline to the rest of the world. But despite the value that many of them place on it, their connectivity is not as high as many of them need or like. So UN studies also have found that about 70% of refugee households have at least a phone, but only about 40% have internet capability on it. At the same time, there are a lot of barriers to refugees' access to mainstream apps and connectivity. And these can include knowledge of how to use these tools, language barriers with the country that they're in, not enough money for connectivity to pay for it, not having access to stable power sources, and location. So urban refugees have higher rates of access than do refugees in rural areas. We also found that technology use for both education and language were really key roles. So both adults and children use technology for education. Adults use it to learn skills, obtain certification, and so forth. And then children are using it for supplemental education, and aid programs are using it as well extensively. One thing that we found in our literature review is that education-related technology really is one of the most common use of technology in the literature. And there's a lot of interest in it because about half of refugee kids globally are out of school. And so, a lot of people are trying to look at, well, how can education be provided more effectively or efficiently, given that, thinking that technology could be an answer. But a big challenge with this is that a lot of the uses of tech in education are really unproven. So while there are a lot of anecdotes and a lot of programs, there really isn't a huge evidence base to support what's actually known or what's effective. And so a lot more evidence is needed to support this type of use. Language is another huge area where refugees use technology. So in 10 out of our 12 focus groups, the refugees mentioned using digital tools for translation or other language learning, and so or even serving as language teachers through some apps. So their ability to kind of navigate the new world they find themselves in can be really modified by tech. We found a number of other uses of technology by refugees. So gathering information for their journeys in particular, so transportation related technology. Some of the refugees in Greece in particular talked about using these tools for smugglers to take them to Europe. They use it for post-arrival information and so forth. Faith-based activity, finding houses of worship or reading the Quran or the Bible or other texts, finding family and friends that they've been separated from, employment, getting access to jobs, and healthcare. And healthcare, many refugees just don't have access to public health care. So they use it to research self-care or find doctors who may be willing to donate care for them. At the same time, we found two big challenges where technology has a lot of potential, but is really underutilized. So the tech is there, but the legal and the policy frameworks are missing to support the use of tech. So the first is identity management. So refugees leave their home countries, and many of them lack papers. But what often happens is they'll use their phones and take pictures of their documents, their passports, their educational certifications, et cetera. But at the same time, those documents just with photographs and so forth are often not recognized in their new setting. There's sometimes no way of really validating their identity. And so while tech is available and possible to use to do this, the government legal frameworks that allow some kind of digital passport really haven't existed, or understanding of how and when this should be used. And in many cases, this is a pretty big gap, because being able to prove your identity really is a fundamental human right, in particular in today's day and age, where if you have to have identity, to be able to access goods and services, to register for healthcare, to be able to access online financing, to be able to buy something online, to move freely through checkpoints, to get a driver's license. There's so many reasons why you need proof of identity, and tech could solve that, but it hasn't. And money management is a key case in point for this, because when refugees work, many times they're not able to access bank accounts because of lack of identity. And so, they could put the money underneath their bed, but that's not very secure. And if they aren't able to get identity and then get access to online finance, they're also not able to purchase things online. Tech is also transforming aid operations. In particular, aid agencies use tech in a number of ways. They manage their activities, they register, they analyze and collect data, and they distribute cash assistance. And cash assistance in particular has grown in importance in recent years, moving the international humanitarian community has moved away from providing, specific baskets of foods and goods, and instead giving cash. And being able to use tech to do this has been important. So the World Food the World Food Program in particular, in I think it was 2018, distributed $1.8 billion of cash assistance in partnership with MasterCard and other banks to be able to do that. Among the other data that's gathered, there really are a number of challenges with that. So Jim will talk more about that when we get to the ethics section, but a lot of data is gathered about refugees. It's got multiple uses, but challenges are that it's also often not connected on platforms, so it can be used kind of from end to end, and there aren't sufficient protections of the data that can be very sensitive when aid agencies have it. So a couple big challenges we'll bring to the fore about these issues. Again, the first is that there's been a lot of investments in apps that often get abandoned later or not maintained. And while refugees really aren't using those, they're instead using mainstream platforms like Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, et cetera. And the presence of this digital litter that's been left really around the internet of apps that were developed and then not maintained can cause some harm if the information is not up to date and people are using it. So I'll pass it over to Jim. You're on mute, Jim.
Yep, so sorry about that. Thank you, Shelley. So a lot, and I see a little bit of discussion in the chat. So there is a lot of technology developments. We found surprisingly a large number of organizations that are developing apps, developing innovative way of using technology, like using blockchain to distribute funds. And there's a program in Jordan that's actually doing that. And one of the issues, though, if you go to the next slide, is that everybody wants to go in and go into the, everybody's trying to come up with an app and come up with a concept development and a one-off thing. The reality, technology has an entire life cycle. So you need to develop the concept, you need to create a product, but then somebody in most cases needs to develop the content. Somebody needs to train the people and the people that are actually developing the content and maintaining the app of how to do that. There's sustainment and maintenance, software patches, but also evolution of the app itself. And then finally, there's a retirement and phase out. People usually just they should be concerned about all of this, but everybody wants to go and have the nice shiny thing in the beginning. One interview, actually, the way she described it was, everybody wants to be at right at the edge of the ocean when they're pulling out a refugee child, but nobody wants to be back in the warehouse folding blankets. Where in reality, once you get that child out, you need to feed it, clothe it, house it for the next how many years, but everybody wants to be in the front end where they can get their picture taken. So there's a lot of stuff that's developed and not maintained. It's the digital litter we talked about, and that creates, and it's a lot of it is money wasted that could have been used more effectively. If you go to the next slides, there's different business models that organizations use. It's either a direct, somebody pays, the UN, it's a direct contract model to pay for some of the technology development. It could be driven by donors. It could be private industry. For reasons of branding or employee retention or public relations, they actually donate time and apps to do this. Could be subscription model, transaction fees, or intellectual acquisition. They're developing intellectual property through refugee apps, but then they use it for something else. So there's different ways, but each different organization has its own little small niche area, and they don't create a larger ecosystem that actually can help across different modalities and different uses of the technology. So if you go to the next slide, so some of the barriers, short-term thinking. Everybody thinks it's a 6 month or a one year project. Nobody thinks 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road. The funding drives what you do in the project, because funders usually operate on a yearly cycle. They won't fund things that over multiple years. And there's emphasis on a lot of these that get as many subscribers as you can, rather than get economies of scale of how you can actually make this cost effective for the refugees at large. A lot of it, somebody in the chat was asking, why is there not more innovative technology? There's a lot of innovative technology, but innovative technology is not enough to solve a problem. A problem is solved is by changing the way you do business and using technology to enable that. But you do have to change the way you do business. There's regulatory organizational complexities, especially since it's cross-border, so not the same laws, not the same regulations applying in different countries. And there's lack of a system-level approach. And when I say system level, if you go to the next slide, I think I have the graphic on that. It's basically, it's not here, but I'll just talk a little bit about it. But basically, a specific refugee population has different needs. And everybody goes and focuses, let's say, on education because that's easy. There's several dozen other things that need to happen. They need to actually have access to healthcare. They need to access to jobs. They need access to the internet. They need access to power to be able to charge their phones. There's all sorts of other things. So they don't think about what the population needs. Everybody has their own little shiny thing that they're trying to develop. So there's nobody that will step in and say, okay, you can do this, X can do Y, and so on and so forth, and try to create a solution, a whole solution, rather than little point solutions that don't match up. If you go to the next slide, is some of the ethical and privacy issues and security issues. So if you go to the next slide, so there's a lot of information that's being collected, and a lot of it is actually some of it is misused, some of it is collected so many times so that the same people go and collect the same information over and over again, and creates fatigue in the refugee populations and mistrust. And so what's really lacking is there is no ethical framework or that guides the deployment of tech. There's sometimes questionable whether some of this tech, as I mentioned, is valuable to the refugees or is just repetitive. Who's responsible for the data and securing the data and the privacy of the data? Some of these refugees, their personal information could cause harm to the relatives that they leave behind. There's an issue of the privacy. And then some of the information, the digital information, is used to implement biases and create conflicts of interest with the people that are trying to help them, or specifically because they push them towards using digital means rather than regular pencil and paper. Then in some countries, that's still the main way of doing work. Then they kind of are left out of some of the ways that the host societies actually solve some of their day-to-day problems. If you go to the next slide, so these are issues, but it can also be a solution. Now, why is there no framework that actually guides how to do this? There's no common consensus on risk. The legal and regulatory requirements are all over the place because it's across multiple countries. There's no consensus about what's a minimum standard. There's some data privacy agreements, especially in Europe, but that's not everywhere. There's different perspectives and different interests and different roles that across very many different multiple stakeholders. And there's general disagreement about what is the proper way of doing this. So a lot of this actually is, is dealt with locally and not in an organized systemic manner. There's nobody in the UN or any kind of higher level organization that has full authority to look at this. You go to the next slide, and I don't know where we are at this. So the recommendation, Shelley, which slide are you? I think it's the next two slides are yours. Or is it mine?
Thanks, Jim. Sorry. Yeah. So going over the recommendations, the first is rather than invest in new apps that aren't maintained, invest in sustained mainstream platforms, digital infrastructure. Refugees need help with connectivity, not new apps. So for donors, making sure they've got access is a priority. And then investing in technical capacity of the humanitarian community as they're using more and more digital tools, ensuring that they've got the training, the access to these tools, the funding to keep using them over time. Next, improve security and ethics. Improvements need to be made in effectiveness and security and data management. There are a number of steps that could be taken. Our report goes over those in some more specificity, along with the need for an ethical framework, given that, as Jim had described, there really is, there are multiple ethical frameworks that are used in some way, but in these settings, but there's really nothing that's overarching about technology across these settings and across multiple countries. And so we're really we're suggesting calling for the UN or some other central actor to lead development of such an ethical framework. This is my last slide, and then I'll pass it to Jim. Next, developing legal frameworks for technology, enabling digital identity and financial access for refugees, figuring out what the legal basis is so that refugees are able to access that, and then improving the evidence base of technology and refugee education. Given that there's so much investment in tech for education, figure out what works and then put the investments there. Over to you, Jim.
Okay, and then I touched a little bit upon it, but you really have to focus. There's a lot of investment being made, both from private and humanitarian agencies and nonprofits, but they really need to be done more strategically. They need to take into account the risks, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, the benefits that will occur for the refugees, and consider the full technology life cycle, not just the upfront, but how you will not only fund, but maintain and continue to develop it across throughout time. And then finally, nobody ever thinks about, yes, you're deploying something, but technology always has a limited lifespan, and you have to start planning early about what's going to succeed in the future, and what's going to be the next step, and how you phase it out and how you pass it on to something else. If you go to the next slide, one of the things we talk about in the report is what we call a wedding registry. So now look at a refugee population, identify what they need, and say, okay, these are the things that need to happen. We need to build an app, we need to build the content, create a database, provide connectivity. This nonprofit can do this, this private company can donate this, and so on and so forth, and build a systemic solution rather than these disorganized and disconnected solutions. And then the last slide, I think, is there a way to the business model that you can actually look at it. There's a way that the private industry does it. So this is an extension, but basically look at it holistically. So you have to understand, when you're doing this tech development, what's your value proposition? So you're meeting certain needs, either a population of refugees or of aid agencies. You have to work through the risks of security, privacy, and so on and so forth. You have to identify what are the key resources you have, and what are the key processes you need to implement. What's your cost structure? What's your revenue structure? And finally, you need to think about upfront, what are the ethical concerns and the ethical issues you need to deal with as you're trying to do this. And once you actually put this all together, then you can understand how to do this holistically and how to create a total solution that will actually work for the benefit of the refugees with a minimum cost. It's fungible with a revenue structure. It minimizes risks, and that can further exist and evolve in the future. Last slide. I don't know if there's one more. I think last slide. That was the last slide. So back over to you, Shelley.
Thank you very much. And I think back to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Shelley and Jim. I think that this is very important for both people who are practitioners and those who are interested in the current state of affairs around them or in nearby countries. I think that this is a very comprehensive view that also helps us see how everyday features we use are a lifeline for millions of people. And also, this is especially important for me to see because so many people demonize refugees for simply possessing any form of technology and trying to use that against them in their attempt to merge with new societies. I would like us to go to the chat box and see the questions we've been receiving. We've received quite a few questions, and there might be other ones coming. I think that you're able to see them too, but let me know if you'd like us to go through them one by one, or if you'd like us to read them all and then answer them together.
I think the first one I already answered. I'll just go through it quickly, but somebody think
yes,
Arthur,
regarding the innovation part asked by Paige Arthur, and then we have a question by Neil Davis. He says, or as this is a philanthropy of tech and isn't included as part of the business module. Do you have any comments on this contribution?
So I think I talked a little bit about the fact that there is innovation. In some cases, there's too much innovation. So, and they're focusing too much on the. So they have a hammer, and everything looks to them as a nail. So they're trying to figure out. No, they have blockchain. The implementation of blockchain in the Jordan case was actually pretty good. Some people are questioning whether they could be done with simpler means, but then they will try now to find other ways to use blockchain, and that's not the right applicable tool in most of the settings. So it's not that innovation is not there, but innovation, as I mentioned, is not always the solution. It says, Neil Davis says, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a business assumption, as in this is a philanthropic use of tech and it is included as part of the business model. I don't know that's the case. As I mentioned, most of these nonprofits and even some of the for-profits that are doing humanitarian work, they don't have an explicit business model. They just have an idea and they're following it. So I don't think they've thought it through in any way that would prevent them from using specific innovation or something else. Somebody has a cool idea and they're just following through with it. That's about it. The last question.
Or let me add there as well to your comments, Jim, about the use of innovation. That as Jim noted, there's a lot of innovation at the front end. People like to innovate, but then the systems aren't in place to maintain it over time. And when we talk to refugees, we ask them, what do you use? We ask them, have you heard of any of these apps that are specifically for refugees? They hadn't heard of them. They use Facebook, WhatsApp, YouTube, pretty much like everybody else. And so I think that's a really big conclusion of the study, that refugees use tech like everybody else. And so, as the world is innovating in tech, refugees will build on that, but in most cases, they don't have tech needs that are specific only to their community. I mean, they'll use GPS, they'll use bus schedules, they'll use communication tools, but a specific app to help them communicate or a specific app to help them use the bus isn't as useful as one that's maintained that everybody uses. So I think that's the balancing line, that if something's going to be innovated, it then needs to have the follow through, and it also needs to have people willing to pick it up. And if they don't know about it because they're using Facebook instead, then that's a wasted investment. Investments, it's not to say that investments aren't needed. Investments are needed, but they're not needed to develop new apps. They're needed to improve access to devices, improve access to connectivity, and then help create and sustain the systems that aid agencies use.
Thank you. There is one more question, and I hope that the viewers can also share the other ones they might have. We still have some time. The other question is around documenting identity as well as money arrangements. And the viewer is saying that it's an issue for non-refugee communities as well, especially in fragile countries outside of urban areas and also inside urban areas. To which extent are those in refugee contexts and those in other types of development work learning from each other on the use of digital tools?
I'll let Shelley take the first part of this. She
Sure.
talked about that.
Then I'll pass it to you. So I think that's a very valid point, that many of the challenges that refugees face with identity, access to technology, access to online finance are pretty similar to their host communities. I mean, there are many countries that have very low financial access, low access to banks, et cetera. So it's not that refugees are always much lower and have very specific needs on that. In many cases, these are they're general needs that everybody has. I think what's specific to refugees are the legal challenges. So if a refugee crosses a border and then is on a refugee status without having certain types of identity papers, or let's say a refugee crosses the border and can't prove really who he or she is, then if they can't get an identity paper, they then can't get access to a bank if they want to. They can't get access to, the internet in some cases, as some countries require, a valid identity card. So there's this additional level of not being able to access the basic, to be able to prove identity, to then access all of these other services. So it's kind of the two-step thing, that there's the proving identity in the legal framework of, well, if somebody flees and they don't have papers, how do you know who they are? Or at least give them enough of an ability to access some of the things that are available. And then there's the next step of how do they access what is available? And that's often a shared challenge with their host community. Pass it to Jim from here.
Oh, yeah, I don't have anything to add to that point, but there's another question, is whether whether the people that are actually in the refugee context, I'm assuming the question is this from Paige Arthur, whether it's the refugees themselves or the people that are trying to help them or the people that are developing these apps, do they actually learn from each other on the use of these digital
This is the one we've addressed.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
This is the one we've addressed in Shelley's comment, but if you have something further to say on this one, feel free to.
Yeah, I was going to say more that do they share the learning from each other? So there is a forum that happens every year. It's called Refugees. It's a large conference, but they also have multiple smaller conferences worldwide. They actually are the leaders in this space. They started out with hackathons to develop, quickly develop apps for refugees. Now they're taking more of a leadership role. They have developed a best practices framework. They're the only ones that I've seen. I don't know how much it is used or across all of the different agencies. So I think there is efforts to try to, to distribute some of the lessons learned. However, there's so many people working in this space across so many different continents and countries that I don't know that it's been done very successfully, or that actually more, I'm sure that more can be done and more should be done. So definitely it's not enough, but we can definitely improve it. But there are people that are working on it.
Mm-hmm. I know that there are many people and organizations watching us right now, and maybe will be watching this later. And I also know that many of the viewers are researchers themselves and people who hope to make sense of the current situation in relation to emerging technologies and refugees. Is there maybe tips or things you wished you've known earlier prior to embarking this journey that you'd like to share with everyone with the time left?
I'll pass it over to Shelley that has more experience in this space.
Tips. Yeah, I think two things that are kind of counter to assumptions going into this study. The first is that I think when many people think of refugees, they think of camp situations, and the last thing that comes to mind is accessing a smartphone. And yet accessing digital technology was really important to the refugees that we talked to across the 6 countries. So, and it's not something that's completely out of their ability to access. And as some of the UN surveys were finding, refugees value this as much as food and shelter and other things, because they're willing to spend big proportions of their income to have it. If they're separated from families, who also were scattered in other places, this is something that's just so crucial to them. So the technology is an important component. It's not something that's secondary. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that was a surprise to me going in. But I think we learned that lesson and tried to apply it here. And then the same thing on the tech. I think when Jim and I went into this study, we thought our recommendations were going to be, here's a list of all the apps that need to be developed to help refugee settings. And the finding was exactly the opposite. I mean, there are some cases where there are specific platforms that are useful, like there's a UNHCR Progress platform, or some financial tools used by the World Food Program, or Activity Info, which is a coordination tool by the humanitarian community. So there are some specific tools that are used, but for the most part, refugees and aid agencies, refugees use technology like other people, and aid agencies use technology like other government, non-governmental, or business settings. And so having access, training, and capacity to standard platforms and taking advantage of innovation in those as they come along, rather than creating a parallel world of technology for refugees. I think those were surprises for us as we did the study.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in particular, the amount of work, I did not expect that. I've been working for information technology for over 25 years. And I had never heard about a lot of these developments. And what's more sadder than that, I'm in the business and I haven't heard it, let alone expecting the refugees to learn it. So for example, there was dozens of organizations that creating job boards, each one of them that had like 10 jobs each or 10 resumes each. So basically you would actually have to go over to 100 apps to get a full picture of what jobs are available or what refugee skills are available. So there's a lot of that. So what we're in the end, instead of recommending to build new apps, our recommendation was stop building apps. Take a step back and start thinking about the problem you're trying to solve and see who else you can collaborate with. That's another thing that we didn't find enough evidence of, and we didn't mention, is that everybody's out doing their Lone Ranger thing. If some of them could come together, 3 or 4 or 5 organizations, and do this collaboratively, they can have a lot more impact. But it's just, there's no mechanism of doing that. And I don't know how that could be solved in the future, but it's definitely a lesson learned that once, if you want to do tech development and you want to go out, look out who else is working in your space. Look at who else you need to bring in. You don't have to do everything. Do what you're best at, but for the rest, bring somebody else that are some other organization can fill in the blanks and work it as a team rather than a small individual nonprofit organization.
Mhm. I think that all of this is very important, and especially with the app and platform building and technology, problem solving could also be a job creation mechanism, because most of the host countries of refugees and asylum seekers are in the global south, where unemployment is a major issue. And I think, as has been previously pointed out, in many countries such as Jordan, refugees, the majority of them actually live outside the camps, which may be very different to the perception that most people will have. And upon seeing pictures of refugees with phones, they might say, "Oh, they're not so different than all of us, then we can just disregard this problem." And it's not the case. Everyday technology that we use, that we check as soon as we wake up, is a lifeline for millions of people. So they're not seen in the same light as we see it. We have 4 more minutes left. We've had an amazing conversation. I've learned so much from you. I was wondering if there are any closing remarks from your side, maybe next steps or other resources published by yourselves that you'd recommend to our viewers.
I think a closing remark would be to reemphasize the need for discussions about the ethics of technology use and how data is used, because aid agencies collect a lot of data from refugees. They collect it often without coordinating. Refugees get data collected from them multiple times. There aren't adequate protections. These are low budget settings. And it's a human rights issue that people's data is just floating around without having adequate protections or their own ability to protect privacy and so forth. At the same time, it's also important to be able to use the data that's there to better serve people. But those frameworks really aren't there. And so, one step which we think is crucial, and it's probably not that hard to do, is a global conference bringing together the tech companies, the humanitarian aid agencies, some governments, some refugee groups, and really nail down what is ethical. How do you treat refugees with decency and humanity with their data, and come up with a set of standards that then countries can choose to adopt by consensus.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll add one more thing. So actually, we did try to organize an international workshop at the Refugee conference 2 years ago. To bring in policymakers throughout Europe, at least, and some of the nonprofits and UN folks, and then COVID hit and nothing happened. So I wanted, on that note, to offer one last thought, is that one issue that we're finding, and I don't know what the solution is, but especially for example, for refugees in Greece, the lack of identity. Right now, if you don't have an identity card proving who you are and a vaccination card, you can't go in and shop you can't go and shop. You can't sit at a cafe. You can't go have a meal at a restaurant. The COVID is going to start making this even more difficult for the refugees, because there's additional requirements for proof or evidence required for a lot of stuff because of COVID, because of the vaccination issue, whether you're vaccinated or not. Keeping track of your vaccination records and digitizing them in the European framework is not automatically done for refugees. So there's additional hurdles to be overcome that didn't exist when we were first when we did our study. So additional work in that area is definitely something that needs to be done, and some solutions need to be offered, and fairly quick, because that population during COVID is in bigger trouble and it has more difficulties than the rest of the world. So I'll close at that comment.
Thank you very much.